When a whole nation rises in the streets, it is not an accident, a whim, or merely a headline. It is the pressure of decades converging into a moment so tense that even the most cautious citizens finally decide they have nothing left to lose. Iran is such a place, a country whose identity and political structure have been shaped by revolution, ideology, regional conflict, economic pressure, and generational change. The protests sweeping across Iran are not just another news story, they are a seismic event. They are the expression of long-building social and economic frustration, political stagnation, and a youth generation that no longer sees a future in the status quo. This wave of unrest is powerful, precisely because it is rooted in multiple layers of discontent. From the inflation that makes bread unaffordable to the political structures that refuse to change. People do not protest without reason. They protest because the conditions that once held society together have begun to unravel. What we are witnessing is not just anger, it is a national reckoning with the very nature of governance, dignity, and survival in a country that has known both revolution and repression. Understanding these protests means unpacking decades of social, economic, and political history, and realizing that what started in the bazaars of Tehran could reshape Iran's future. In late December 2025, a wave of protests began in Tehran's historic Grand Bazaar, not with slogans of abstract ideology, but with shopkeepers closing their stalls. These were merchants, the backbone of traditional urban economic life, expressing despair not merely over prices, but over the collapse of the currency that sustained them. As the rial plunged to historic lows against the US dollar, purchasing power evaporated almost overnight, pushing millions into economic uncertainty. Inflation soared past 40%, for some essential goods rising even higher, leaving everyday life beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. A generation that came of age, hoping for stability and opportunity, suddenly found itself scrambling to afford basic necessities. These conditions sparked a simmering discontent, and like sparks on dry tinder, it ignited across cities, provinces, and social groups. The protests did not remain confined to the bazaars. They spread quickly through universities, neighborhoods, and workplaces, while slogans shifted from economic grievance to political challenge, reaching criticisms of the nation's leadership itself. In this moment, what began as a bread-and-butter protest became a broader expression of frustration directed at the core of the political system. Unlike some widespread uprisings that begin with symbolic or moral grievances, the 2025-2026 Iranian protests were triggered primarily by economic collapse, a crisis that affected almost every family in the country. Iran's economy has been under extreme strain for years, amplified by international sanctions, declining oil revenues, and persistent government mismanagement. By late 2025, data showed inflation had surged upward toward 50%, and the national currency, the rial, had lost massive value, plunging to historic lows. For ordinary Iranians, this wasn't a number on an index. It was reality at the grocery store and the gas station. Food prices skyrocketed in some sectors, increasing by over 70% in a single year, while wages stagnated. Even staples like bread and rice became symbols of economic insecurity. This collapse was not sudden, it was years in the making. Sanctions imposed over Iran's nuclear program restricted oil exports, the country's principal source of revenue, cutting foreign currency earnings and shrinking public resources. The government's failure to stabilize the economy and protect purchasing power transformed economic frustration into urgent public anger, creating conditions ripe for protest. The initial outbreak of demonstrations focused on Iran's historic Grand Bazaar, a centuries-old commercial hub of Tehran, still central to the country's urban economy. When Bazaar merchants closed their shops in protest, it was not merely an act of defiance, it was a symbolic rupture between the traditional economic class and the state. Bazaar strikes have a unique power because they disrupt daily life and signal that even sectors once crowned by economic culture are collapsing under current conditions. What triggered shop closures was the irreversible depreciation of the rial, which made imports expensive and profit margins unsafe. Merchants found themselves unable to sustain business, pay suppliers, or even meet basic financial obligations. Thousands of vendors walked out, closing shutters and spilling into public squares. These actions laid the framework for a broader movement, drawing in students, workers, women, and youth who saw their own struggles reflected in the bazaar's commercial pain. Once the protest expanded beyond one economic sector, it gained momentum and legitimacy, representing not just one class, but a shared national frustration. Amid chants and slogans, the movement began to take on political overtones erased in earlier economic protests. Iran's economic turmoil did not begin overnight. Years of insufficient economic reforms, reliance on oil revenues, and bureaucratic mismanagement created structural weaknesses that sanctions only worsened. When oil exports declined due to international restrictions, the state's revenue base contracted dramatically. With reduced foreign reserves, Iran struggled to defend its currency. The rial's collapse amplified every other economic problem. Inflation ate into savings. Workers' real wages shrank. Small businesses already operating on thin margins were pushed toward bankruptcy. Government subsidy programs that had once provided partial relief became unsustainable. Attempts at currency reforms, including altering exchange rates and subsidy structures, were too little, too late, and often worsened public perception of misrule. For many Iranians, the cumulative effect was a profound loss of confidence in the government's economic competence. This distrust spilled into the streets, where citizens loudly connected economic failure with political failure, making economic explanations inseparable from political ones. In protest slogans, the cry for economic change often intertwined with broader demands for accountability, transparency, and political reform. These demonstrations did not remain contained to one group or one city. They spread nationwide, from Tehran to Isfahan, Shiraz, Mashhad, and beyond. Protests expanded to 27 of Iran's 31 provinces, encompassing both large urban centers and smaller towns. What began with merchants returned support from students, workers, ethnic minorities, and even farmers facing separate economic pressures like water scarcity and power shortages. This geographical spread showed a shared national discontent rather than localized unrest. Protesters chanted not just about prices, but about systemic mismanagement and corruption, linking economic hardship to political repression. The slogans, including those criticizing the leadership or calling for broader political change, began to reflect the frustration of entire communities, not just particular social sectors. Instead of being isolated grumblings, these protests became an expression of a wider demand for dignity, opportunity, and transparency. What is particularly notable is that the involvement of diverse groups, from merchants to students, gave the protests staying power and symbolic weight as no single demographic could be easily dismissed by the state as fringe or morally suspect. At first, many outside observers described the unrest as purely economic, but as demonstrations continued, anti-government sentiments became increasingly explicit. Chants that once focused on prices expanded to calls against the political leadership itself, even directly criticizing Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and at times expressing support for alternative political figures. This shift reflects a key dynamic. When economic hardship becomes widespread and persistent, it can transform into political dissent. People no longer protest shopping lists, they protest governance. In Iran, decades of limited political freedoms, combined with harsh suppression of dissent and limited channels for political expression, meant the population had few institutional avenues for addressing grievances. As economic conditions deteriorated, the interaction between daily insecurity and political repression fostered a sense that the system as a whole was failing citizens. What started as protest against economic pain gradually became a broader critique of the regime's legitimacy, leadership, and priorities. Many Iranians now chant for not just reform, but systemic change, a dramatic shift in public expression that marks a more profound challenge to the status quo. In the modern age of connectivity, communication plays a critical role in protest movements. Social media and mobile messaging had been instrumental in spreading awareness, organizing demonstrations, and sharing footage of events in real time. Yet this threat to state narrative control prompted a harsh response. Iran's government instituted nationwide internet and communications blackouts, cutting off phone and data networks to hinder organization and obscure international scrutiny. This strategy of flattening information flow limits the ability of protesters to mobilize and the world to witness their actions, but it also intensified frustration at home and abroad. The internet blackout not only affected protest coordination, it also affected everyday economic activity, further hurting businesses and citizens. Critics have called such censorship a blatant tool of political repression. The clash between digital connectivity and state control illustrates how contemporary protests are shaped not just by economics or politics, but by battles over information, visibility, and narrative. The unrest must be understood in a longer historical context of political repression. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran's political system has concentrated power in unelected religious institutions, with limited democratic mechanisms. Over decades, critics, journalists, activists, and minority groups have faced imprisonment, harsh trials, and executions under national security laws. In recent years, authorities intensified crackdowns on peaceful dissent, subjecting journalists, human rights defenders, and activists to arrests and unfair trials that carry long sentences or worse. As rights groups have documented, security forces frequently respond to protests with unlawful force, including beatings and live ammunition. These patterns of repression suppress dissent, but also deepen resentment, creating a cycle where economic grievance intersects with historical frustration at lack of political freedom. When generations feel they are denied voice and basic rights, protests become not just economic acts, but struggles for dignity and legal recognition. Iran's economic problems, and thus the protests, cannot be isolated from global geopolitics. For years, economic sanctions, particularly those targeting oil exports, have drastically reduced national revenue weakening foreign exchange reserves and driving inflation. Renewed sanctions following disputes over Iran's nuclear program worsened this trend. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign policy involving regional military engagements and support for allied groups has demanded expenditure that many citizens perceive as prioritizing external agendas over domestic welfare. Public frustration grew as basic economic needs went unmet while resources were directed outward. This tension fed narratives that the government's priorities were misaligned with the needs of ordinary Iranians. For many, the link between sanctions, foreign entanglements, and domestic economic pain became evidence of systemic failure rather than external causality. As a result, the protests reflect not only anger at economic hardship, but also disillusionment with long-standing political strategies that fail to protect citizens' livelihoods. One of the most powerful forces behind Iran's ongoing protests is a deep and widening generational divide. Nearly 60% of Iran's population is under the age of 35, meaning the majority of citizens were born long after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. This generation did not experience the revolution's promises firsthand. Instead, they inherited its consequences. While older generations often frame sacrifice, resistance, and ideology as necessary for national survival, younger Iranians measure success by opportunity, personal freedom, and global connection. They have grown up connected to the outside world through social media, travel, and digital culture, making isolation and restriction feel increasingly artificial and unbearable. For many young Iranians, unemployment rates above 20%, restricted cultural expression, and limited political voice create a sense of blocked future. Education no longer guarantees stability. Degrees lead to underemployment or emigration. This generation does not protest merely to change policies, it protests because it feels excluded from shaping its own destiny. The street